Thanks very much, Tom. Our final speaker this evening is Darach McDonald. Darach he studied history at university and made a special study of the border Protestants of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal in terms of the Boundary Commission. He has been editor of the Ulster Herald in Omagh in County Tyrone. He's a native of County Monaghan. He's now living in County Tyrone. He's written a number of books, including The Sons of Levi and The Chosen Few, and most recently, a book of his has been the subject of a BBC documentary. It was a study of blood and thunder bands, and tonight he's going to talk about the experience of Unionists in the Lost Counties. Darach McDonald.
I've been asked to talk about the experience of Ulster Protestants who found themselves in the Free State. And I begin, like Eamon did earlier on, with a Saunderson. In December 1921, Major Somerset Saunderson declared, "Now I have no country." He echoed the sentiment of many others after the Anglo-Irish Treaty sealed the deal on partition. Like other Ulster Protestants who found themselves marooned on the wrong side, Saunderson was bereft of hope and he was bitter. He never returned from England after writing that epitaph to Hugh Montgomery of Blessingbourne in 5 Mile Town. Today, Castle Saunderson, that Eamon mentioned, which is in County Cavan, near its convergence with both Fermanagh and Monaghan, is a shell overlooking the River Finn where it flows into the Erne. Somerset Saunderson's reaction is particularly noteworthy, I believe, because his father, Colonel Edward Saunderson, was the first leader of Irish Unionism in the House of Commons. In his 2005 biography of Edward Carson, Geoffrey Lewis called Saunderson the authentic voice of Ulster Presbyterianism. Not bad for a member of the Church of Ireland. He was elected as Liberal MP first for Cavan, and then later, after he had lost his seat, he was elected as a Conservative for North Armagh. And he was an Orangeman, a pugilist, a boat builder, and a man of narrow piety, according to Geoffrey Lewis. He was also the mentor and inspiration for Carson, and like his parliamentary protégé, his roots were outside of the 6 counties that would become Northern Ireland, but he was decidedly of Ulster. The Saundersons were by no means unique in their fervour for Ulster and for Unionism. I was struck by this recently at the start of our current decade of centenaries, amidst all the promised hoopla to mark the momentous year of 1912 when Ulster Unionism struck out on its own. In my occasional blog, Frontier Post, I noted the otherwise unmarked passage of the 100th anniversary of Ulster Unionism's first major rally. It took place in Omagh at the very start of January 1912, long before April's big gathering at the King's Hall and Carson's trail to the Covenant. It could be said that Omagh set the scene for 1912 when it drew a remarkable crowd of 30,000. They came from West, Mid and South Ulster, and many of them came by rail. I had a look at Omagh train arrivals for that day before the rally commenced at 11:35 a.m. There was the usual scheduled service from Belfast through Portadown and the other from Derry via Strabane. But there were also 18 special trains bringing passengers from Cavan, from Ballyburgh, from Belturbet, from Cootehill, Bundoran, Clones, Castleblaney, Smithborough, Monaghan and Glaslough. Among Omagh's platform speakers, with Carson and the Marquess of Hamilton, was Lord Darach, whose ancestor, incidentally, had introduced the Act of Union at Westminster in 1801. The Dartrys, or Dawsons, from Monaghan are now gone, just like the Saundersons and Farnhams of Cavan, commemorated only in local street names. Yet though the big families faded from view, there was no doubting the commitment of Unionists on the periphery of the province. Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal blood flowed among the signatures of that solemn league and covenant. 2 full battalions of Ulster volunteers were raised in County Monaghan alone, and with others from Cavan and Donegal, many of those volunteers marched off to fight for king and country in the 36th Ulster Division. Yet despite obvious enthusiasm for the cause, they endured a decade of trauma and political uncertainty before they were told in no uncertain terms at the Ulster Unionist Hall Convention held on 10th of March 1920 that they were surplus to requirements. In the immediate aftermath of the Ulster Hall shunning, Lord Farnham wrote to Montgomery, "Apart from breaking the covenant, what we feel more than anything is that we can no longer call ourselves Ulstermen. We in Cavan were prouder of being Ulstermen than anyone in the whole province." Montgomery replied, "There is no use arguing about the meaning of the word Ulster. Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan are part of Ulster, but they are not part of the Northern Ireland segregated in the bill." And therein lies the nub. For a decade before partition, Ulster Protestantism had forged its identity as being different from the rest of Ireland and of being united in covenant. When the covenant was broken, the Ulster Unionists of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal were not only denied their political redemption, they were robbed of their identity. Although Monaghan Unionist leaders such as Colonel John Madden dismissed this new Belfast-made covenant of 1920, and the Monaghan County Grand Chaplain remarked that in Belfast they are all home rulers now, that was face-saving rhetoric. The grave prospect facing the Protestants of Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal was summed up by Monaghan's Grand Master and erstwhile Ulster Unionist Council member Michael Knight, who said that they must, quotes, "no matter what eventually takes place, rely upon ourselves and upon ourselves alone." So as leaders of the new Northern Ireland administration set about forging a new political identity and styling themselves as Ulster, what befell their former fellows in the lost counties? If we read Trinity historian R.B. McDowell's history of Southern Unionism, Crisis and Decline, they ceased to be Ulster Unionists. But while many did migrate across the new frontier, aided in some cases by those intent on shoring up vulnerable Unionist numbers in Fermanagh and Tyrone, the majority didn't give up quite that easily. Just like nationalists marooned in the 6 counties, many Southern Protestants in the border counties placed their faith in Article 12 of the new Anglo-Irish Treaty, the Boundary Clause. When the Commission was eventually convened, it received representations from those pockets of Ulster Protestants left behind by the tide. As with most representations, they did not want to remain cut off from their co-religionists by the new frontier. Even those who supported the border wished it to be placed somewhere else rather than on their doorstep. So numbers were bandied back and forth, largely based on electoral registers and the most recent census, which had taken place in 1911. From these, we reckon that a total of something just over 70,000 Protestants were living in the 3 Ulster counties at the time of partition. The pattern of population and the ratio differed widely between the counties and, of course, within the counties themselves. So while Donegal's 35,000 Protestants represented about 18% of that county's population, Monaghan's 19,000 Protestants notched up almost 30% of the population there. And that was concentrated overwhelmingly in the north of the county. East Donegal's Lagan Valley was an Ulster Presbyterian stronghold, but North Monaghan's population was remarkably similar to contiguous districts of Fermanagh, Tyrone and Armagh. It is worth noting in passing that J.R. Fisher, former editor of the Northern Whig, who was appointed by Westminster as Northern Ireland's Boundary Commissioner, noted that dispersal of population. He had urged Craigavon, who was a confidant of his, to consider a new boundary to include all of Donegal and North Monaghan, with a frontier line from the southern tip of Upper Loughearn to Bessbrook. That would shorten the border by about 2/3 of its meandering length and leave out most of South Armagh. That would avoid, said Fisher, quotes, "an Afghanistan on our northwest frontier, while including most of those we want and leaving out those we don't." In the event, the Boundary Commission recommended few changes from the county lines of partition. East Donegal was to transfer to Northern Ireland, part of East Fermanagh around Clones was to go to the Free State, and the small district of Mullyash between Castleblaney and Darkley was to go north in exchange for Crossmaglen and Forkhill. Not that any of that mattered, because another deal was done and the line stayed where it was. The Protestant minority in those southern border counties were, as Michael Knight warned in 1920, on their own. Yet in many respects, they remained different from the Protestant pockets elsewhere in the Free State. Protestant celebrations continued throughout the 1920s, but ended when a 1929 Cootehill parade of black men from Monaghan and Cavan was attacked and the banners stolen. Henceforth, Orange Lodges paraded locally without fanfare and then went north for the big events. Of course, Protestants migrated steadily down the years, drawn to Northern Ireland in many cases by family ties, by marriage and by employment prospects, as much as by the desire to recover their Ulster Protestant credentials. The imposition of Irish language requirements for public service jobs in the South alienated many. The overtly Roman Catholic veneer of public life proclaimed in the mammoth Eucharistic Congress of 1932 set the tone, and the 1937 Constitution accorded a special position to the Catholic Church that was only removed in 1972. Protestant sons went north for jobs in the public sector, banks and police. Daughters went for teaching, nursing and other careers, as well as for marriage. As late as 1934, however, East Donegal's Protestants were still petitioning for transfer with 7,000 signatures. Yet it wasn't all lost. In the years immediately following partition, Monaghan's Protestant leaders devised a political strategy. While denied their Ulster Unionist credentials, they organised as the Protestant Association and forged an organisation that would maintain their presence even during the darkest times. For years, the Protestant Association more than held their own in the affairs of Monaghan County Council and the urban district councils of Monaghan Town and Clones. As late as the 1960s, when I was growing up in Clones, the council chairman, Bobby Malloy, declared openly that he was still an Ulster Unionist. A decade later, an elderly neighbour from across the Diamond told RTE's Tommy Gorman that when she died, they could turn her upside down and they would see Ulster Protestant stamped on her. Well, she did get a wee bit carried away and nobody looked. In national terms, however, a pattern was established of electing a Protestant to Dáil Éireann, first for Monaghan alone and latterly in the combined Cavan-Monaghan constituency, where Heather Humphreys recently took over from Seymour Crawford. Protestant politics in the three counties leaned towards Fine Gael, but for a period Erskine Chillers managed to wrest Monaghan's Protestants' vote away to Fianna Fáil. But there was a sea change with the onset of the Troubles. Already inclined to the reputed posture of Larne Catholics, Protestants in the southern border counties retreated from view. Clones High School, where many pupils came from adjacent areas of County Fermanagh, closed some years after the GNR rail connections to Enniskillen and Belfast. So having grown up in a town with a strong Ulster Protestant demeanour in the 1950s and 60s, I watched from afar as Clones changed, particularly after Bloody Sunday, when huge numbers of Protestants left for Canada, Britain and even Bangor. Local Protestant politician Senator Billy Fox was killed in a botched IRA raid, the first member of the Oireachtas shot by the IRA since Kevin O'Higgins in 1927, and now all but forgotten in the fray. Interestingly, Fox had lost his seat to Childers when some Protestant electors became uneasy about his campaigning over border road cratering, which also imposed a huge impediment on Protestant farmers and church congregations along the border. Meanwhile, I was researching my master's thesis on the Boundary Commission, slowly realising that a huge voice from our shared past had gone ominously silent. I later wrote a fictional voice for them, the Sons of Levi, now out of print. That was after the peace process began, and I remember at that time having many encounters with people who had nervously kept to the shadows. One young man was about the same age as my older son Ross, and had grown up in a strong Protestant community around Duhat Orange Hall. He described his schooling and social life to me, not much different from my son's. I asked him if he ever went to Clones, a 10-minute car journey. He looked at me in horror. No way, that's a rebel town. Huge efforts by the Clones Community Forum and other peace-funded bodies have restored a more balanced view among all sides since then, not least the trapped minority of Ulster Protestants. The wonderful work of President Mary McAleese in building bridges has restored their pride and their place in who and what they are. The Ulster Scots movement, with leaders like Jim Devaney in Donegal, Angela Graham in Monaghan, and Charlie McAdam in Cavan, have given them a voice of their own. Slowly, the trapped minorities of the lost counties of Ulster are emerging from the shadows. Rusnaula's pre-12th in Donegal and the quaintly named Drum Picnic, a traditional parade of Ulster marching bands in Monaghan, are providing public showcases for their culture. On both sides of the border, more and more people are realising that there never was the clean cut promised by Britain's Prime Minister Lloyd George in 1921. So the learning process goes on as we lick old wounds and expose them to fresh air. We sense now that there was hurt and a deep sense of betrayal on both sides, and that this has persisted for almost a century. With acceptance of our different stories, healing can take place along with the learning. For as I have discovered, we are all reflections of each other, no matter which side of the mirror or the border we find ourselves by accident of birth. So thank you.